Have you ever felt forgotten by God? Maybe it was when you lost the job you desperately needed, or when illness struck your family without warning, or in those countless nights of prayer, crying out for a breakthrough only to be met with silence. You've done all that Scripture commands. You've tithed faithfully. You've fasted with devotion. You've walked in obedience. Yet while others testify of blessings overflowing, you remain waiting, wondering. And in the depths of your heart, you've asked the question no one dares to voice aloud. Lord, why have you not answered me? But here is the truth: God has never turned his ear away from you. Your prayers have not gone unheard. Your faith is not lacking. Because buried deep within the pages of history, a sacred revelation hidden for centuries is now being brought to light. At St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, in the very desert where Moses encountered the burning bush, an ancient palimpsest was discovered, a manuscript erased and rewritten over time. Through ultraviolet light, scholars uncovered a third layer of text beneath an ancient Vatican library manuscript. And what lay hidden was more than just scripture. It was a prayer so powerful that the early disciples used it to call forth divine provision, miraculous healing, and unshakable peace. A prayer spoken in secret among the faithful, later concealed, buried, and lost to time. But now in this very hour, it is being revealed once more. Because these sacred words contain a divine key, a prayer not of begging, but of supernatural alignment with heaven's abundance. When you pray these words with faith, something shifts in the heavenly realm. Debts are erased, sickness disappears, broken relationships are restored, doors of divine favor open, and suddenly you realize God was never silent. The fullness of divine prayer was kept from you. Until now. If you are ready to step into the abundance, healing, and restoration that God has destined for you, then keep listening, because in just a few moments, I will reveal the missing prayer that has the power to transform your life. And once you speak these sacred words, your life will never be the same again. Hi, my name is Jim Friedman, and life was never easy. But no matter how hard things got, I always found a way to pull through. I had my wife, Sarah, my 2 kids, Emma and Noah, and a quiet, unwavering faith that God was with me. We didn't have much. Most weeks, I'd be counting crumpled dollar bills just to make rent. Dinners were often bread and beans, sometimes just beans if payday was still too far away. My old beat-up car wheezed more than it roared, and the heater in our tiny apartment hadn't worked since last winter. But we had love. On Sundays, we'd sit around our wobbly kitchen table, sharing the last slice of bread, breaking it into 4 pieces, and saying grace. Sarah would smile, even when the cupboards were nearly empty. Emma and Noah, just 7 and 9, would giggle, turning our thin blankets into forts, finding joy in the simplest things. And through every struggle, I held tight to my faith. I believed that God saw us, that he knew our struggles, that he had a plan, and that no matter how dark the night, his light would guide us through. But then, everything changed. My mother was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, a woman who had never touched a cigarette in her life. I wrestled with the thought of, why was she being punished? Why would God allow this? And as if the weight of my mother's suffering wasn't enough, my finances began to spiral. Bills stacked up. I started borrowing from friends just to keep things afloat. The pressure was unbearable, but the breaking point, the moment that shattered me, came late one evening. I sat by her hospital bed, her body frail, her breathing shallow. The machines beeped steadily, reminding me that time was slipping away. She reached for my hand, her grip weak, yet full of love. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered words that would haunt me forever. If anything happens to me, do not resuscitate. I felt my chest tighten. Mom, don't say that. The doctors... She shook her head, cutting me off gently. It would be a waste of money. My heart shattered. A waste of money? How could she think that? She must have seen the pain in my eyes because she gently squeezed my hand, mustering the last of her strength. You've been a great son, she whispered. Then after a brief pause, her voice wavered, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. I know I don't say this often, but I'm so proud of you, my darling. Her words broke something inside me. That was it. That was all she wanted to say. Not about her pain, not about the fear of dying, just me. I couldn't hold it in. I buried my face in the thin hospital sheets, my tears soaking into the fabric. She had spent her whole life sacrificing, and even in her final moments, she was still thinking about me. That night, she slipped into a coma. The doctors pulled me aside, their voices hushed, their faces grim. Prepare for the worst. I stood there numb, staring at the sterile hospital walls. My world was caving in, but what I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly imagined, was that my life was about to be impacted in a way that defied all logic. What happened next would change everything. The night after my mother slipped into a coma, I couldn't bear the weight of it all. The hospital walls felt like they were pressing in on me, suffocating me with grief, doubt, and exhaustion. So I did the only thing that made sense. I walked. There was a small beach near the hospital, quiet and deserted at this hour. The waves rolled in gently, the salty breeze filling my lungs as I wrestled with my thoughts. Lord, I don't understand, I whispered into the night. Why have you allowed this suffering? I had done everything right. I had prayed, I had tithed, I had believed, and yet my world was unraveling. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart stop. A man thrashing in the water. He looked like he was drowning, his arms weakly moving against the current. But there were no cries, no desperate screams for help, just silent struggle. Without hesitation, I ran into the water, pushing through the waves. The cold bit at my skin, but I pressed forward, reaching for him as he began to sink. "Hold on!" I shouted, wrapping my arm around his body and kicking hard, dragging him back to shore. We collapsed onto the sand, both of us gasping for air. I leaned over him. "Are you okay?" And then something strange happened. The man opened his eyes, looked directly at me, and with a calmness that sent chills through my body, he said, "I was expecting you." I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. "What?" He sat up slowly, brushing the sand off his arms, his expression completely at peace. "God sent me here," he said with certainty. "I was told to wait for you." A shiver ran down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked hesitantly. He smiled. "My name is Paul." Then reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small wooden box. It looked old, worn, yet something about it felt sacred. He placed it in my hands. "Inside this box is something that has been hidden for centuries," he said. "A prayer passed down from the time of the prophets. A prayer of divine abundance, supernatural healing, and unshakable favor." My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside was a small, delicate manuscript, the edges browned with age. Carefully, I lifted it, my fingers tracing over the faded script. Paul watched me for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know of Elijah?" he asked. I nodded. "Of course, the prophet of fire, the man who called down rain in a drought." Paul's eyes gleamed as he continued. "Yes, Elijah was a man of great miracles. He shut the heavens so it wouldn't rain for 3.5 years. He called fire down from heaven. He outran King Ahab's chariot. But do you know what made Elijah truly powerful?" I frowned slightly. "His faith," Paul smiled. "Faith, yes, but also his prayer." He tapped the manuscript. Elijah's power didn't come from himself, it came from the words he spoke. He understood the divine secret of prayer, the alignment with God's will that moved heaven and earth. That is why when he prayed, things happened. He took a breath before continuing. In 1 Kings 18, when Elijah stood against the prophets of Baal, they chanted and screamed for hours, but their gods did nothing. But when Elijah prayed just once, fire fell from heaven. 1 Kings 18:36-38. Paul leaned in, his voice unwavering. Elijah's prayer was different. It was not begging, it was not pleading, it was alignment, a declaration of God's will, spoken with full authority. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing into me. Paul continued, his voice steady and sure. And the same way Elijah prayed for fire, he prayed for rain. The land had been barren for years, no crops, no harvest. People were starving. But when Elijah knelt on Mount Carmel and prayed, he didn't just ask for rain, he spoke it into existence. He locked eyes with me. He sent his servant to look toward the sea, and 6 times the servant saw nothing. But Elijah did not waver. He kept declaring, And on the seventh time, the servant saw a cloud, the size of a man's hand, and within hours a mighty rain came, breaking the drought. 1 Kings 18:42-45. Paul placed a hand on the manuscript. This is that kind of prayer, the kind that brings supernatural provision, the kind that releases divine favor, the kind that calls down miracles just as Elijah did. My heart pounded. And now, he continued, it is being revealed again. To you. I shook my head, overwhelmed. But why me? Paul's expression softened. Because you have been crying out to God, searching for answers. And just as God provided for Elijah in the wilderness, just as he sent ravens to feed him when he had nothing left. 1 Kings 17:6. He placed a hand on my shoulder. He is providing for you now. Tears welled in my eyes. For the first time in a long time, something shifted deep within my spirit. This was no accident. This was no coincidence. This was a divine appointment. And I knew without a doubt, my life was about to change forever. That night, as I sat beside my mother's hospital bed, I held the manuscript tightly in my hands. The room was dimly lit, the beeping of the machines the only sound breaking the silence. I looked at her frail, unmoving, her breathing shallow. The doctors had told me to prepare for the worst, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I took a deep breath, fell to my knees, and with every ounce of faith left in me, I prayed the words. I didn't beg, I didn't plead, I declared. And as I spoke the words aloud, something shifted in the air around me. It was subtle at first, like a warmth spreading through my chest, a presence I couldn't see but could feel. It was as if heaven itself had drawn near. But that night, nothing happened. I stayed by my mother's side, holding her hand until the first light of morning streamed through the window. Her condition remained the same. No movement, no change. Yet somehow I wasn't discouraged. Something in me knew I had touched something real. The next night I prayed the words again, and this time, something happened. In the stillness of the room, my mother's fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttered, and then weakly, softly she whispered my name. I jumped up, hardly believing what I was seeing. Her lips trembled, her voice barely above a breath, but she looked at me and smiled. For the next 14 days, I prayed beside her every single night, and every day something changed. She got stronger. The color returned to her face. Her breathing deepened. The doctors, who had once spoken only of comfort measures, now began using words like remarkable progress and unexpected improvement. By the end of the second week, she was sitting up, speaking and walking. A month later, the doctors ran another set of tests, and that's when the miracle was undeniable. They called me into the office, their faces pale with disbelief. They shuffled through her charts, pointing at the scans from a month before: blackened lungs, aggressive cancer spreading. Then they pointed to the latest scans. Nothing. Not a single trace of cancer. One doctor shook his head. We don't know how to explain this. There's no medical precedent. This has never happened in the history of this hospital. Another doctor muttered, almost to himself, maybe we misdiagnosed. But I knew the truth. It wasn't a misdiagnosis. It was God, and it didn't stop there. On the 5th day of my mother's recovery, something else happened, something I never saw coming. I was called to the hospital's finance office. I braced myself for the worst, knowing the bills had stacked higher than I could ever pay. But instead, the woman at the desk looked at me, puzzled. Sir, your balance has been cleared. I blinked. What? She checked the screen again. Someone covered the entire cost of your mother's treatment, every single cent. I asked who. She shook her head. They wished to remain anonymous. I stood there stunned, and just when I thought God had done more than I could ever ask for, another miracle followed. That same day, I received a call from my employer. I had been working hard, but I was barely scraping by. Yet now, out of nowhere, I was being promoted. Not just a small raise, a promotion with a salary increase, full benefits, and a massive bonus. It was more than I had ever earned in my life. I fell to my knees that night, overwhelmed. I knew there was only one reason behind all of this. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the power of this prayer. The same prayer that Elijah prayed. the same prayer that calls down divine abundance, healing, and supernatural breakthrough. And now, it has changed my life. One evening, as I was walking home, still in awe of everything that had happened, the miracle of my mother's healing, the supernatural provision, the divine promotion, I saw him. Paul. He stood at the end of the street, hands folded behind his back, watching me as if he had been waiting, just like that night on the beach. I stopped in my tracks. My heart pounded, not in fear, but in a deep, unexplainable reverence. As I approached, he smiled. "You see now, don't you?" I nodded slowly. It was God, all of it. He never forsook me. Paul's eyes shone with something deeper, something holy. "No, he did not. For it is written, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." Hebrews 13:5. I swallowed hard. Those words hit differently now. Before, I had doubted. I had questioned. But now, I knew them to be true. Paul stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But now you must understand, this prayer was not given to you just for yourself. God answered you, but he is calling you to something greater." I listened intently as he continued. "You are not the only one who has suffered. There are many who are still in the valley crying out, waiting, desperate for breakthrough. And just as Elijah called upon the power of heaven and brought rain after a long drought, so too must you call forth this blessing upon others." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "It is time for you to share this prayer, to be part of God's mission." Something in my spirit stirred. I knew he was right. I had spent so much time believing I was alone in my struggles, but there were countless others burdened with sickness, drowning in financial hardship, pleading for a miracle, and God had given me the key. Paul smiled again. "Remember what Jesus said, 'Freely you have received, freely give.'" Matthew 10:8. I nodded, conviction settling deep in my soul. "Yes, I will share it." Paul looked at me one last time, his expression full of quiet joy. "Then your journey begins." And just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. That was the last time I ever saw Paul, but his words never left me. From that day forward, I knew what I had to do. This prayer, the same divine key that called down miracles in Elijah's time, was not meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be released. It was meant to break chains. It was meant to transform lives. And so, with great faith and obedience, I began sharing it. And now I call it the Elijah prayer key. For just as Elijah called forth fire from heaven, just as he spoke and the rain came, this prayer is a direct alignment with God's supernatural provision, healing, and abundance. And if you are ready, if you truly believe that God has not forsaken you, then this key is meant for you too. Because once you pray these words with faith, the heavens open, and your life will never be the same again. The Elijah prayer key is not an ordinary prayer. It is not a prayer of begging or desperation. It is a prayer of divine alignment, a sacred utterance that moves the heavens and calls forth God's supernatural provision, healing, and favor. This is the same kind of prayer that Elijah prayed, a prayer that shifts the spiritual atmosphere and releases the power of God into your life. For when Elijah prayed, he did not merely ask, he declared. He stood on God's promises, spoke with heavenly authority, and heaven responded. When he prayed, fire fell from heaven. 1 Kings 18:36-38. When he prayed, the drought ended and the rain came. 1 Kings 18:42-45. When he spoke, the widow's flour and oil never ran dry. 1 Kings 17:14-16. When he called, life returned to the dead. 1 Kings 17:21-22. This prayer is a direct connection to God's divine will. It aligns you with the supernatural flow of blessings, healing, and restoration that God has already ordained for your life. Just as Elijah stood before God in bold faith, this prayer invites you to stand before him not as one who begs, but as one who is already an heir to his promises. When you pray these words with faith, breakthroughs are unlocked. The barriers that have kept you stuck begin to crumble. Healing is released. Sickness and affliction bow to the power of God. Debt is lifted. Just as God sent supernatural provision to Elijah, he provides for his people. Doors of favor open. Opportunities come forth that no man can shut. Restoration begins. What was lost is brought back, and broken relationships are healed. This is not about wishing. This is not about waiting. This is about stepping into the fullness of what God has already prepared for you. It is not a man-made formula. It is not a ritual. It is the spoken alignment with divine authority, just as Jesus himself taught. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, "Be lifted up and thrown into the sea," and do not doubt in your heart, but believe that it will happen, it will be done for you. Mark 11:23. God has never desired for his children to live in lack, sickness, or despair. He has already made a way, but it requires faith to activate it. The Elijah prayer key is the spoken key of faith that unlocks the supernatural. And now, after being hidden for generations, it is being revealed once more. If you have ever wondered why your prayers seem unanswered, if you have ever felt like heaven was silent, if you have ever longed for a breakthrough that only God can provide, then this is your moment. Are you ready to step into God's divine abundance? The same God who sent fire at Elijah's command, the same God who made the rain fall after 3 years of drought, the same God who raised the widow's son from death, is the same God who is waiting to move in your life today. But he is waiting for you to take the step of faith. Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. Jeremiah 33:3. So now, the choice is in your hands. Will you continue to struggle, to wonder, to wait, or will you take hold of the Elijah prayer key and step into the life of abundance, healing, and restoration that God has already prepared for you? Because once you speak these words with faith, your life will never be the same again. God has brought you to this very moment. This is not a coincidence. This is a divine appointment. You have prayed, you have waited, you have cried out for a sign, and now the answer is before you. The Elijah prayer key has unlocked miracles, breakthroughs, and divine favor for those who have spoken it in faith. And now, it is your turn. You are standing at the threshold of God's abundance. You can either step forward in faith or walk away, wondering what could have been. All throughout Scripture, we see that God moves when his people take action. Moses had to stretch out his staff before the Red Sea parted. Elijah had to call forth rain before the drought ended. Peter had to step out of the boat before he could walk on water. And now it is your turn to step forward. This is more than just receiving a prayer. This is about stepping into a covenant with God. And because I have freely received, I freely give. There is a nominal fee to ensure that this prayer reaches as many people as possible. But I want to be absolutely clear. I will not take a single cent from this. Every single contribution will go toward feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, and spreading the gospel. This is not about money. God does not need our money. This is about obedience. This is about faith. This is about stepping into the divine economy of heaven where blessings flow through you and to you. God's word is clear. When we give, we open the door for God to pour into our lives. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. Luke 6:38. What you sow today will become the seed for tomorrow's harvest. This is your moment. The door has been opened. The key has been placed before you. But only you can step through it. Only you can say yes. Yes to God's divine provision. Yes to God's supernatural healing. Yes to God's unshakable favor. Do not let doubt steal your breakthrough. Because when you pray these words with faith, the heavens open, and your life will never be the same again. Your time is now. Step forward.